So the general function of the nervous system is communication. It lets distant parts of your body talk to each other. The two cell types involved are neurons and neuroglia. Messages travel by an electrical impulse called an action potential. One of the big things we'll be looking at in this chapter is how the action potential works. Axons, parts of the neurons, are in bundles that travel together and carry a message as a group. When they are bundled together in the peripheral nervous system, so around the edges, they're called nerves. In the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, they're called tracts. Where cells meet is called a synapse. We saw this at the neuromuscular junction. It'll be the axon of one neuron meeting either dendrites or the cell body of another neuron. And we'll review neuron structure and add some more detail to it than what we covered back in tissues. To get across the gap between the two cells, you need a neurotransmitter. That is some kind of chemical secreted by the first cell. And so the example we've already seen, the neuromuscular junction, is a synapse with acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. The two major parts of the nervous system are central and peripheral. Sometimes you'll see them abbreviated as CNS and PNS. CNS gets used a lot, PNS not as much. Central is the brain and spinal cord. And then everything else is peripheral. It's the nerves that bring information to the brain from your sense organs and your sense organs themselves. The nerves that take messages out to muscles and organs to tell them what to do. There are three major types of communication. There's sensory, which is the input. And that's part of the peripheral and everything that's coming in towards the CNS. Integrative information is the processing. That's done mostly in the CNS. There is a little bit of processing in the peripheral, but most of it is central. And this is your thinking, decision-making, even processing that reflex where you pull your hand away from the hot thing. The output information is called motor information, even if it's not for movements. So it controls both your skeletal muscles and involuntary organs like glands, stomach, the heart, and so on. In the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, we have receptors that collect information from inside the body, things like monitoring your temperature, and from outside the body, like what you see and hear. Those receptors convert the information into an electrical impulse, which is carried by the neurons to the central nervous system. The motor division, the CNS sends a message that goes out to an organ to control it. Then there are two subdivisions of motor based on where the information is going. The somatic division controls your skeletal muscles. Autonomic controls glands and smooth and cardiac muscle. And then within autonomic, we have two more subdivisions: sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, instead of going to separate organs, sympathetic and parasympathetic go to most of the same organs, like the digestive tract and the heart, but they give it opposite instructions. Sympathetic prepares the body for stress situations like an emergency or even just exercise where you just need more energy. Parasympathetic is for long-term maintenance activities that when you've got something more immediate going on, you can just let those things sit and come back to them later. And then when you're able to relax, you can put the effort into, say, digestion. We'll talk more about the autonomic nervous system in Chapter 11. That deals with the divisions of the nervous system. Most of it is spent on the brain because it's the most complex, but we'll also look at the spinal cord and peripheral. So, any questions on the organization of the nervous system? Here's a little schematic flow chart. So, everything to get into central comes from and goes to peripheral. All the input is sensory, all the output is motor, and then motor is either somatic or autonomic. Autonomic is either sympathetic or parasympathetic. Cells in the nervous system, or the cells in nervous tissue, we're going to take a closer look at now. You've got neurons are the ones that transmit information. They're the ones that carry action potentials around the body and do the communication. Neuroglia are support cells. They don't send the messages, but they're essential to the neurons being able to do their work. Looking at the neurons first. Where most of the time you think of the cell as just this one compact shape, there's a part of the neuron that's more of a chunk like that, and that's the cell body. That's where it has the nucleus and most of the organelles. And then there are projections attached to the cell body. Some of these projections are called dendrites, which just means branches. The dendrites carry messages toward the cell body. They pick it up from a receptor or another cell. Another type of projection is an axon. Axons carry messages away from the cell body. Where the axon meets the cell body is called the axon hillock. It doesn't necessarily look that different from where the dendrites meet the cell body, but functionally it's important because it's where the action potentials are always going to start. There's only ever one axon hillock. one axon connected to the cell body, but it may branch further out. When it does, those are called collaterals. And then at the tips, which is usually going to be multiples, it spreads out into a little ball called a synaptic knob. Now, there are a lot of different names out there for these little bulges, depending on which textbook you're looking at. There's a psychology book, I don't know if you use it here, that calls them synaptic bulbs. I've seen them called synaptic buttons, axon terminals, all kinds of different things. So because our textbook says synaptic knob, that's what I'll use on a multiple choice or something. But for a fill-in, I'll take any of the names I've heard for it. Here's another version with little rhymes that tell you what it does. I wish I could take credit for this, but I can't. I found it online. And it also talks about the synapse and some neurotransmitters. GABA, glutamate, and serotonin are some more examples of neurotransmitters. And it has another name for the synaptic knobs, which is terminal buttons. On some axons, there's a special substance called myelin that speeds up the impulse or the action potential. So it lets the nerves communicate faster. It's not part of the neuron, it's provided by another cell. Not all neurons have myelin on their axons. Nerve tissue where there's a lot of myelin is called white matter, because myelin is white, and the whole tissue looks lighter. Nerve tissue without myelin is called gray matter. You might have heard of gray matter as part of your brain. Gray matter is what does most of the processing, because instead of needing to take a message long distance to tell you that you stubbed your toe or control a muscle, it's neurons right there together talking to each other and making a decision. Questions on neuron structure or myelin? Neurons are classified into a couple of different kinds. There's two categories of classification. Structure of the neuron, which is based on how many of these projections they have, and functions of the neuron, which type of communication they carry. That's based on how they're lined up. Are they set up so that their message goes towards the CNS? Are they within the CNS? Or are they set up to take their message away from the CNS? So are they sensory, integrated, or motor? Starting with number of projections. The categories are the same as for our carbohydrates, 1, 2, and a lot. But the carbohydrates used Greek, mono, di, and poly. The neurons use Latin, uni, bi, and multi. And what goes with it is polar. So how many poles stick out from the neuron? You can think of it that way. A unipolar neuron will have one projection, bipolar will have two, multipolar will have many. Out of those projections, only one can be an axon. All the rest would be dendrites. What we usually see first is a multipolar neuron. One axon, many dendrites. Multipolar neurons are all located either partially or completely within the central nervous system. When they are motor neurons, their dendrites and cell body are in the central nervous system, and then the axon goes out to whatever organ it's going to control. Bipolar neurons one axon and one dendrite. The dendrite may have some branches to it, but it all joins into one before it connects to the cell body. The dendrite, or the axon, again, may have branches, and they all go into axon terminals, or synaptic knots. So here's a model of a bipolar neuron. We've got a dendrite here, connects to the cell body, and then the axon comes off on the opposite end. We also have a multipolar here. Oh, the axon tied itself in a knot. Don't want that. So, one long axon, whole bunch of dendrites that are connected.